Ukraine has made a major move. Russian troops endured horror in Crimea when Putin intended to enter Kiev. He came all the way from Crimea. However, the battle has had the opposite effect. Ukraine's current scheme has harmed the Russians greatly. The Russian presence in Crimea is soon to be obliterated. Russia decided to take Crimea in 2014, sometime before the Ukrainian war. Despite the fact that Ukraine had suffered a crushing setback, it was unable to make a sound due to the administration at the time. However, one of Ukraine's top concerns right now is reintegrating Crimea into Ukrainian territory. As a result, Ukraine is expected to adopt quite different actions in relation to the war. When the locals in Crimea were contacted, it was apparent that they were similarly dissatisfied with the Putin administration. But Ukraine's final step was enough to change everything because Russia had occupied Crimea for a long period. It had transformed the region into a full military headquarters in preparation for a possible battle. Knowing this, Ukrainian soldiers chose to target ammo dumps and Russian headquarters in their operations. However, as Russia's demand for weapons mounted despite the country's already dire economic situation, Putin became more belligerent. This scenario resonated all throughout the world, especially since we followed completely different strategies in this region. A massive fire broke out in the Russian Navy's fleet in the Black Sea not long ago, very close to the Crimean Peninsula. Along with this fire, 8 persons were killed and 2 were injured. However, this operation has once again demonstrated Ukraine's will to retake Crimea. When Putin recognized this, he decided to intervene in Crimea. The Tavrida Highway was named after the most important of these efforts. The Tavrida Highway was built to serve as a link between Sevastopol and Simferopol. A big number of Russian soldiers stationed in Crimea agreed to help build this road. The largest blow to the Russian army, however, has already been exposed. A 2-story hotel building nearby houses Russian soldiers operating in this area. Indeed, with the unexplained fire of this hotel, the Crimean people's reactions began to emerge. Although Putin refers to the fire that broke out here as an electrical leak to avoid seeming as a leader who cannot even safeguard his own country's borders, the hidden organization in this region has taken over everything. This group, which calls themselves the Crimean Fire Group, is continually protesting Russia. At the heart of these rallies is a desire not to fight the Ukrainian army. The Russian army has recently begun to face a severe personnel shortage. On this premise, the Ukrainian area has suffered 2 consecutive defeats. Putin, who has lost over 180,000 men since the beginning of the war, has ordered a new mobilization. Although this mobilization usually encompasses the entire country of Russia, when thoroughly investigated, it was discovered to be based on minorities. However, it was discovered that this was a plot to destroy the minorities in certain areas. That is precisely why the Crimean Fire Group was established. This group of young people, many of whom did not want to fight, began to maintain the regular demonstrations that they organized. When Putin learned this, everything changed in this territory. Putin has declared a state of emergency. This is the point that has inspired numerous protests. But it comes as no surprise that Putin's bad policies are at the root of everything once again. Putin had already suffered crushing setbacks against Ukraine as a result of his PO decisions. With these defeats, many Russian soldiers wanted to abandon the battle and accept Ukraine's victory, but Putin would not have it. Although Putin has coordinated countless operations against Ukraine since then, nearly none of them have been successful. However, there was another quite different explanation for this failure. A substantial number of hesitant soldiers in the Russian army began to deliberately interfere with operations. Following that, as the Ukrainian army's advantages grew, the Russians began to grow to a more desperate state. However, Volodymyr Zelensky's words had far-reaching consequences around the world. However, it was already stated that a huge population of Crimeans had taken action to flee to Ukraine. Putin was completely responsible for this. For a long time, Putin has been perplexed about what to do regarding Ukraine, with the fact that he sought to pull around 40,000 Crimeans into the war. There was a lot of confusion in Crimea, especially with the last mobilization decision. A big number of Crimeans and Russians from Crimea have fled to Ukraine. This group, which will seek residency in this region, has stated that they will do all possible to avoid fighting on Putin's side. Following it, the advent of widespread tension in the country significantly altered the situation, and Volodymyr Zelensky's words on Crimea reawakened optimism among the Crimean people. However, it has once again been shown what Ukraine considers when drawing red lines. It was already known that the Ukrainian soldiers' principal purpose was to inflict a massive defeat on Russia, but with Russia's domestic problems worsening, it was just a matter of time before the Ukrainian army triumphed. However, if the current situation continues, the Ukrainian army will be victorious in a matter of days. But we must not forget Putin, who played a critical part in this win. If only Putin hadn't made two bad decisions in a row, the Ukrainian army was not going to surrender so easily. War experts' statements on this tragedy have reverberated around the world. According to war analysts, while there are various reasons why the Ukrainian army gained such a large victory, the fundamental reason is that Putin has caused a lot of anxiety by pursuing such ineffective methods. Although Putin's invasion elicited a global response from the start, everyone began to take cover against Putin, especially as his aggressive policies proceeded. However, Putin has reached a point where he isn't sure what to do. People in their own country are reacting to Putin's harsh and illegal policies in reality. In recent days, a sizable portion of the Russian army has begun to protest Putin's problematic policies. If the situation continues in this manner, Ukrainian soldiers will continue to take advantage of the beneficial positions they have at their disposal to bring Russia to a point where there is no turning back. If this is successful, the Ukrainian military will be able to physically drive Russia out of their area. The premise for this will most likely be Russia's economic difficulties. For a brief time, the Russian army faced severe challenges in Ukraine, but it has already entered its worst economic phase. However, as Russia's problems grew more serious, the Russian army began to face major challenges as a result of these problems. When their families were harmed by their country's prolonged economic crisis, many soldiers began to remark that they wanted to stop fighting and that peace should come soon. Furthermore, the impact of recent breakthroughs made by the Ukrainian army, in particular, is fairly high because Putin is aware of this. He is continuously using massive propaganda to try to suppress this failed administration in his dictatorship. However, if he is unable to suppress them through propaganda, the Russian army faces even greater challenges. And if a crisis occurs, Putin's resignation will be on the table. The Russian army's largest military airbase is on fire. The Ukrainian army's air campaign has driven Russian President Vladimir Putin insane. The Ukrainian forces destroyed the Russian army's Su-25 fighter plane and K-52 chopper. Russian forces, which have been conducting airstrikes on Ukrainian territory from the beginning of the war, are now launching airstrikes in areas where ground operations have failed. Russia has carried out several airstrikes on Ukrainian territory using unmanned war aircraft supplied by Iran, its ally, Juil. The Russian army, which has been holding Ukrainian land for more than a year, is no longer as strong as it was in the early months of the war. The Russian army, which invaded Ukraine on February 24 last year, was able to seize numerous districts by moving fast. However, when the Ukrainian ally countries became involved in the conflict, the Ukrainian army inventory grew fairly big, thorough, and equipped with modern military technology. The Ukrainian army was able to immediately reverse the direction of the war, thanks to the military weaponry that the United States and other Western countries initially delivered to Ukraine. Following that, Russian soldiers began to employ their long-range missiles to break the Ukrainian army's might. Although the U.S. has delivered Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine, the quantity of these systems is insufficient to secure all Ukrainian areas. Russian soldiers launched an airstrike on the city of Dnipro, where the Ukrainian army is concentrated. Because the Ukrainian army did not deploy its air defense systems in Dnipro, the Russian intelligence service was caught off guard for this strike by Russian soldiers. The Russian army has begun striking residential areas in Dnipro with 3 long-range Iskander missiles. Iskander missiles fired near the Russian army headquarters in Dnipro struck an abandoned medical building, and fortunately, no one was hurt. The hospital building was demolished within seconds after the missiles hit it. The Russian military, however, did not stop there. It conducted a fresh bombing on the city of Dnipro using Iranian-made unmanned combat aircraft. This attack was directed at the Dnipro energy infrastructure complex as a result of the Russian army's onslaught. A portion of the city of Dnipro was without power for 2 days. Zelensky's patience has been tested yet again by Russia's latest offensive. Zelensky agreed to transfer one of the capital, Kiev's air defense systems, to Dnipro, while also sending one of the HIMARS missile systems to Kiev. The original goal of Zelensky was to eliminate the epicenter from which the Russian forces started their attack, and so it was that the Ukrainian army effectively destroyed a Russian military airport on the Crimean Peninsula with HIMARS missiles that were delivered to the city of Dnipro. Ukrainian leaders requested assistance from the American intelligence service, their friend America, in locating the military facility from which Russian forces launched unmanned combat aircraft to assault Ukrainian territory. The response to Ukraine's request was prompt. Using satellite imagery, the American intelligence service discovered that the military airbase is located in Simferopol, Crimea. Without delay, the Ukrainian army launched a large-scale offensive to destroy this military installation in Crimea. However, the air defense systems in Crimea posed a significant challenge for HIMARS missiles. Russian President Vladimir Putin had deployed air defense systems in various Crimean cities, fearing that the Ukrainian military would commence attacks on the peninsula. On top of that, Ukrainian commanders planned to divert attention by utilizing unmanned combat aircraft called Bayraktar. Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles flew into Crimea at high altitudes and managed to enter Simferopol's airspace. At this point, Ukrainian army leaders entered the coordinates of the Russian military airbase into the HIMARS missile systems delivered to Dnipro and initiated the operation. 6 HIMARS missiles were on their way to Simferopol. With the missiles approaching, Ukrainian unmanned combat aircraft breached the Russian air defense system's radar by flying in at high elevations. The Russian Panzer air defense system launched all of its missiles against Ukraine's unmanned combat aircraft. The Bayraktar UAVs, which have a highly capable maneuvering mechanism, were able to avoid some of the air defense system missiles, but one of the Bayraktar UAVs plummeted to the ground after being struck by a missile. The Russian servicemen were reloading the air defense system's missiles when they became aware of the approaching HIMARS rockets. The Ukrainian army successfully launched 6 HIMARS missiles at a Russian military airbase. The HIMARS missiles fired at the Russian airbase destroyed the Russian Su-25 fighter plane and the K-52 combat helicopter on the runway. The HIMARS missiles, which were unable to effectively reach their objective, collided with the runway, rendering it unusable as a result of the Ukrainian army's air operation. The Russian army's major air facility in Crimea was destroyed. With this operation, the Russian army is anticipated to refrain from launching airstrikes on Ukrainian territory for an extended period of time due to the Ukrainian army's lack of long-range weaponry. The Russian army has been conducting airstrikes on Ukrainian territory since the beginning of the war. Initially, the U.S. government refused to provide long-range missiles to the Ukrainian military. The U.S. administration anticipated that Ukraine would plan operations within Russia's borders, escalating the conflict. As a result, the U.S. was hesitant to deploy long-range missiles to the Ukrainian army. However, the Russian military carried out airstrikes on many civilian areas in Ukraine, exploiting the Ukrainian army's lack of long-range weaponry. Furthermore, Ukrainian state leader Volodymyr Zelensky demanded long-range missiles from the U.S., again citing the Russian military's involvement in war crimes in Ukraine. This time, the U.S. administration responded affirmatively to Ukraine's request. The United States has deployed long-range missiles to the Ukrainian army in response to Russian forces attacking residential areas in Ukraine. After the HIMARS missiles were delivered to Ukrainian soil, the Ukrainian army quickly launched a retaliatory offensive against Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainian army, which conducts air operations in the Belgorod region, Russia's border city with Ukraine, carried out operations in Belgorod city against the Russian ammo storage and energy infrastructure facility. The ammo dump that Russia used to transport ammunition to Russian soldiers on Ukrainian territory was destroyed as a result of this operation. Russia suffered millions of dollars in damage as a result of the damaged ammo storage. Furthermore, following the operation on the energy infrastructure facility, a large portion of Belgorod was without power for an extended period of time. Following this operation, coordinated by the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian state leader Volodymyr Zelensky issued a statement declaring that the Ukrainian army can conduct operations inside Russian borders and retaliate against Russian forces if they so desire. The Russian army reduced its strikes on Ukrainian territory after the Ukrainian army began employing HIMARS missiles. However, Vladimir Putin has stated that they will begin utilizing nuclear missiles immediately in order to maintain their military edge. Vladimir Putin has stated that nuclear weapons will be delivered to Ukrainian territory in the near future and will be employed. The U.S. administration, on the other hand, is strongly opposed to Russia's use of nuclear missiles in Ukraine. Russia and the United States are currently at odds over the use of nuclear missiles in Ukraine. Crimea has seen critical advances. The invading Russians have begun fleeing the region one by one. Russia's strategy has failed yet again. When they learned that the Ukrainian army had finished preparing for the spring offensive, tens of thousands of Russians opted to return home. This development, which occurred even before the Ukrainian army initiated the spring campaign, severely harmed Ukrainian troops' morale, and the resources the Ukrainian army requires have miraculously fallen into its hands. The Ukrainian army began to conduct radically diverse actions in the final days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. For a long time, it has been known that the Ukrainian army's primary aim has been Crimea. However, it was well known that Ukraine had made significant efforts to recapture Crimea and was continuously demanding assistance. This operation is about to take place. According to recent developments, the Ukrainian army is planning a massive coup. Russian troops have reached a stage where they are unsure what to do against Ukraine. With this recent development, everyone is aware that Ukraine's decisive triumph is still a few days away because the Russians in this region were aware of the Ukrainian army's sensitivity. Things mentally shifted in Ukraine's favor. There was no Ukrainian organization that could stand up to Putin when he invaded Crimea in 2014. As a result, Ukraine was unable to protect Crimea by providing the necessary response at the moment. Following the outbreak of the conflict under Zelensky, the Russians feared they were in big trouble when the Ukrainian army was able to reply. While they sought to attack Ukraine, Russia has paid a high price for this war from the start of the war. The Ukrainian army received a substantial portion of its support for self-defense. However, in response to these, the Ukrainian army now intends to make measures that will end the war. And because all countries across the world believe that the war should finish now, the Ukrainian army has begun sending various sorts of support. Tanks were initially dispatched to Ukraine to provide support. Tanks from the European Union and the United States, both of which are regarded as extremely potent offensive weaponry, helped Ukraine make the key maneuver. However, Ukraine's most recent step permitted the Russians to depart Crimea because the spring operation will take place in accordance with the Crimean opposition organizations. The Ukrainian army has taken significant moves aside from the intimidation provided here. The Ukrainian men began to count the days till triumph. Ukraine rejected Russia's latest request to engage for peace, but its determination to decide in favor of Russia on the Crimea issue. Aside from that, things began to change totally in favor of Ukraine. As a result of the people in Russia also causing large demonstrations and expressing strong opposition to Russian officials, the anti-war protests allowed the Ukrainian army to operate freely. On the other hand, the mental breakdown of Russian soldiers who failed in operations made it simpler for Ukraine to execute its duty. However, recent developments have indicated that the Ukrainian army has now completed its preparations and will strike the greatest blow to the Russian army. When the Russians learned about this, they promptly left Crimea because the Russians anticipated that Ukraine would battle to reclaim the first Crimea. Although Putin attempted to halt the evacuation in Crimea, at this point, he was unsuccessful. The Russian army suffered a terrible backlash as a result of the heated public outrage and the breakthroughs of Ukrainian soldiers. The fact that the majority of the soldiers in Crimea do not want to serve in this territory has exacerbated Russia's dilemma. The Russian army is in a horrible situation since Crimea, which is considered the rest of the front, has actually become the primary center of activity with phony or actual intelligence. It has provided the Ukrainian army, which is aware of the developments that have brought the Russian army back, is creating the stage for future public uprisings and Russia's forced exit from Ukraine. However, Ukrainian operatives in the Russian army have indicated that there are far more serious issues, and these advancements, as reported in the international press, have transformed the Ukrainian army's successes. The Ukrainian army is now taking more strategic measures against the Russians. The most essential of these strategic initiatives were operations against trucks carrying Russian army needs, such as ammunition and supplies, as well as heavily traveled routes. The actions made to leave this territory on their own, rather than engaging in a heated fight with the Russian army, have been documented as a new plan of the Ukrainian army. The Russian forces were unqualified to respond, but it has turned out that if Ukraine becomes the victor in this battle, Putin will be in serious danger. With these decisions, Russia faced the worst crisis in its history. Russia is facing a major challenge both politically and economically. Putin, who stated at the start of the war that he would occupy Kiev within 2 weeks, has now stated that this battle is critical to Russia's future. This crisis has once again demonstrated to the rest of the world that the Ukrainian army has advanced to the point where it is capable of winning the war. The fact that identical language is coming from Russia explains how likely it is that Ukraine will win the war quickly. While the prospect of widespread mobilization in the near future grows, it is expected that Russia can only break out of this bind. In this manner, however, the reactions of war experts to these new events will be felt all across the world. According to war analysts, the Ukrainian army's mental advantage can ensure that things continue in Ukraine's favor because the Russian army is experiencing significant difficulties. The Ukrainian army has more opportunities than ever before. The Russian army has deteriorated dramatically as a result of Putin's misguided policies. Putin was also at the heart of the Russian army's decline during the Soviet era. Here are some shocking facts about it that have had far-reaching consequences over the world. Putin has been committing significant mistakes and crimes since taking over the Russian government. However, the number of bureaucrats concerned that the Russian army may stage a coup has dramatically increased. To avoid this and win the war, Putin undertook a massive purging of the Russian army. He pushed out any top general in the Russian army whose name was mentioned in the coup and who had a population in the army. The Russian army, on the other hand, has lost its established organization and strength, and the Russian army has reached a point when it will pay dearly for its weakness. Putin, who has consistently miscalculated Ukraine's power, believed that the Russian force was still as powerful as it had been in the past until now. This is how the Russian army was depleted during the battle. Putin was chastised once more for these failings. If things continue as they are, the Ukrainian army will have very little time to move the battle to Russia's borders, if not into Russia's borders, if not into Russia. Putin is also to blame for these failures, in addition to the problems that would face the Russian army. If Putin loses this battle, the Ukrainian army will benefit greatly. It will only be a matter of time before Ukraine increases its regional power and puts Russia in more difficulty. Ukraine's win, on the other hand, may galvanize other satellite countries in the area. And with the moves that the Ukrainian army will take following the loss of the unbeatable Russian army, things may completely change in Ukraine's favor. Although the Russian army has taken attempts to cause the Ukrainian army to lose since the time it became aware of the challenges, it will never be able to regain a superior position. This will pave the way for things to be pushed uphill for Ukraine to change all of the opportunities that it now has in reaction to a significant number of Russian forces. And thanks to the Ukrainian army's successful measures, the complete removal of Russian servicemen from the region will allow it to glorify itself again, according to the studies and other activities exposed. As a result, Putin's resignation will be back on the table. Ukraine has occupied Crimea. When Putin learned about this unbelievable operation, he went insane with rage. Important choices have been taken regarding Crimea. Remains have begun to revolt against Russia. Ukraine's operation caused significant damage to the ships at the port of Sevastopol in the Black Sea. Russia's hands are tied. Ukraine's latest operation will put an end to the war with Russia. The Ukrainian army acquired a significant superiority over Russia in the last days of the Ukrainian war. The fundamental reason for this is that Ukraine can make the most of the chances available to it. In reaction, the invading Russian army withdrew from 70% of the land that it had long occupied. Many of the ammunition left behind by the evacuation entered the Ukrainian army's stockpile with the instruction from the Kremlin. The Russian army deployed into a defensive stance immediately following these actions. In other words, the current situation in Ukraine has the potential to shift the fight to Russian soil. Ukraine has delivered a devastating blow to Russia with its newest operation. The most visible aspect of Ukraine's recent actions has been its intelligence. Ukrainian intelligence, which has received specialized training from Israeli and U.S. intelligence, has now advanced to a new level. Russia appears to have made no attempt to resolve the situation. Many of Ukraine's successes are the result of Russian intelligence failing to perform enough job. However, with this current offensive, the Ukrainian army has once again stated that Crimea is theirs. Ukraine has spent a long time planning for this operation. Since the Ukrainian army's sensitivity to Crimea was known, the entire world was expecting another operation similar to the previous ones. But no one could have predicted that Ukraine would progress so far. Russia was retaining its fleet of warships in Sevastopol. According to information acquired by Ukrainian intelligence, after learning about the situation, Ukraine moved to plan an operation in the region. Many destroyers in the area were laying the groundwork for Russia to achieve control in the Black Sea. In the event that they vanish, Russia's dominance in the Black Sea would be finished. Ukraine became aware of this and proceeded to devise an inventive scheme. The pre-planned strategy was centered on Ukraine's arrival into Sevastopol. The anti-Russian fire group in Crimea was called in order to ensure that no one was affected by the intended bombing. The fire group has been ordered to totally evacuate localities near the port of Sevastopol. For the operation's duration, this once again demonstrated to the rest of the world Ukraine's regard for civilians, especially during times of war. The Ukrainian army dispatched flag officers to the Black Sea port of Sevastopol to plan the operation's route, recognizing that Russian soldiers in this region are not waiting for the arrival into Crimea. The Ukrainian army has dispatched a big flotilla to this region. At this point, the Ukrainian army's clever plan also began. The Ukrainian army has activated the squadrons that will be dispatched to Crimea. The Ukrainian special forces formed the long-range Patriots while Ukraine's squadrons were on the move. This circumstance would allow them to attack the port of Sevastopol immediately. The fleet's landing ships would also reach Crimea's interior, clearing the last Russian soldiers and ammunition. However, at this time, the Ukrainian army was the victim of a minor arithmetic error. When Ukrainian fleets began to approach Crimea, nationalists were given orders. Patriot missiles with long-range capabilities were on their way to the port of Sevastopol. Before the signal jammers were triggered, the Russian army informed Moscow of this important operation, but it was too late to seek assistance. When the Patriots arrived, the Ukrainian army was ready to arrive. 4 of the harbor's warships were completely destroyed while the Ukrainian army left one of its ships behind for shelling. For landing craft continued into the port.